Welcome everybody. This is a really incredible occasion to have two voices speaking on a very hot topic in anticipation of the elections next week, and a topic that is a very contested side of history, and we're going to discuss today about how history is constructed through monuments. And we have two amazing speakers, Irene Cheng, who has recently written a book on modern architecture and race. She edited the book with Mabel Wilson. She's an associate professor at the CCA and director of the Experimental History Project, a great thinker, and Richard Sommer, who is working at Cooper Union as a visiting professor. Of course, he has been dean the University of Toronto for 2 terms, very well-known school, and is also working on a project on monuments. Stephen Hillier will introduce our speakers more properly. He's going to moderate the event tonight. Stephen is the director of the Cooper Union Archives, the curator of everything at Cooper Union, and he's working on an exhibition on monuments, so this is an experiment for him as well to moderate this important discussion. So thank you so much, Irene and Richard, for accepting this invitation. I just want to say one last thing. As part of this online experiment, this is the second session of the Entanglements series, where we have 2 presentations that are bringing together an external visitor and thinker outside of the Cooper Union, which in this case is Irene, to discuss a subject with a Cooper Union professor, and followed by live debate. So we're going to have 2 lectures followed by live debate. So thank you both so much for accepting this invitation. Stephen, I hand you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lydia. And thank you all for coming this evening. As Lydia mentioned, I am the director of the Architecture Archive, but I am also this semester a student, in that I am attending the class that Richard is teaching with Glenn Forley, which is Architectures of Time Making Over the Monument. And in addition to presenting the histories of individual monuments and trails that have come to define the American landscape, the course is also seeking to unpack some of these histories and delve into the problematic narratives and truths that are embedded within them. So students in the seminar who've joined us this evening have been researching individual monuments and are now taking steps to make gestures to recast them in a new light through architectural interventions that will hopefully allow their complete stories to be told. And that's the content of the exhibition that we're seeking to put forth this coming spring. So I first want to introduce our 2 speakers. Irene is an architectural historian and an associate professor at the California College of the Arts. Her research explores the entanglements of architecture, culture, politics, and the environment of the 19th century and early 20th century. Her most recent publication that Lydia mentioned is Race and Modern Architecture, A Critical History from the Enlightenment to the Present, which was co-edited with Mabel Wilson and Charles L. Davis II, and that was actually published this year. And that book is part of a multi-year interdisciplinary research initiative directed by the editors called the Race and Modern Architecture Project. Irene has currently a project underway, another publication project, The Shape of Utopia, the Architecture of Radical Reform in the 19th Century America, which explores the geometry of architectural projects affiliated with radical antebellum movements. She is founding principal of Cheng and Snyder, a multidisciplinary design practice, and she is co-director of the Experimental History Project at CCA. Richard is a professor of architecture and urbanism at the Daniels Faculty at the University of Toronto. He recently completed 2 terms there as the dean, and during that time he expanded the school's programs and transformed a civic landmark in Toronto, 1 Spadina Crescent, to serve as its new home. Before 2009, Richard was a member of the Architecture and Urban Design faculty at the Harvard GSD for more than a decade, and was also director of the school's urban design programs. He founded the design practice Borfax BLU in 1995, and is also a member of the executive board of Places Journal. His writing includes many articles in magazines and journals, and also books, several books, Shaping the City, Urban Design, Fast Forward Urbanism, The Democratic Monument in America, a 20th Century Topography, and Commemoration in America, among others. So his design research and writing, and really a project that he's been working on for decades with Glenn Forley, is seeking to examine the transformation of monument making and society's aspiration toward a democracy, with a very particular focus on America. So the way this will go is Irene will speak first, followed by a response from Richard. And then after that, we'll engage in dialogue and take some questions. If you'd like, you can pose questions during the presentations in the chat that we'll get to later. And we can certainly open up the discussion live. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Irene, please.
Okay, great. Can you all see my screen?
Yep.
Yep.
All right, so thank you so much to Lydia for the invitation to speak, and to Stephen for the kind introduction and for moderating the discussion, and also to Richard, my co-presenter, who I'm looking forward to being in conversation with. So I want to say at the outset that I am not an expert on this topic, that I started really thinking about monuments a few years ago when I organized a conference at CCA called Reckoning, sort of thinking about racial histories and monuments. So I'm not coming as an expert, but when Lydia sort of invited me to participate in this kind of dialogue, I thought, what a great opportunity to think through some of these questions and ideas together. Okay, so I want to start by stating the obvious, which is that the reason that we are talking about monuments right now, the reason why this conversation is so charged at this particular moment, is because of the protests for racial justice that erupted this past summer following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis on May 25th. As all of you know, Floyd was killed by a police officer who kneeled on his neck for approximately 8 minutes, an event that was captured in a video which quickly spread online, generating widespread outrage and protest. And while many of the protests understandably centered on police stations, on city halls, and other symbolic sites of state authority, others focused on monuments, especially monuments to the Confederacy, which over the last few years have become key sites for debates about white supremacy and racial justice. Very quickly, within weeks, if not days, of Floyd's murder, dozens of Confederate monuments in Birmingham, Montgomery, Richmond, Atlanta, Nashville were taken down. In some cases through spontaneous protester actions, and in other cases by municipalities. Besides monuments to figures like Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis, statues of Christopher Columbus, Theodore Roosevelt, Andrew Jackson, and Woodrow Wilson were also targeted. And in Europe and England, monuments to imperial era figures were similarly sites of popular protest and calls for removal. One of the reasons why monuments were so quickly targeted here in the US, and also maybe why one of the reasons why Floyd's death was so incendiary, is because this wasn't the first, but the latest of a series of incidents that had been building up, simmering, starting with the first wave of Black Lives Matter protests that began in response to the killing of Trayvon Martin in 2013, followed by Michael Brown in 2014, the Charleston church shooting in 2015, perpetrated by a young white man who was an avowed white supremacist. In the Charleston shooting in particular, that it sort of reignited a debate over what to do with symbols of the Confederacy, a debate that came to a head in August 2017 when white supremacist protesters and counter-protesters clashed in Charlottesville, Virginia, over the fate of a statue of Robert E. Lee. This was the protest, of course, when one of the white supremacists drove his car into the crowd, killing one woman and injuring 40 others. And subsequently, Donald Trump responded by saying that there were, quote, very fine people on both sides. Sorry, so hence when George Floyd was killed, the pump was primed to turn to Confederate monuments again as symbolic targets of protest. I think, people had a sense of like, how is this still happening? It seems like it's way past time for these monuments to come down. And I think there's a kind of temporal dimension of sort of recursiveness and overdueness that, we're operating here. Now, I want to pause here and think about these two kinds of visual artifacts, the video and the monument. Both are these kinds of supercharged representations or symbols capable of catalyzing protest and political action. Both speak in their own ways about the systemic racism at the core of American society, but they do so in very different ways. Videos of Black men and women being killed by the police offer gripping displays of the bare violence of white power and Black subjection. Their immediacy is both their power and their pitfall. The circulation of these images can also turn Black suffering into a spectacle, one that exacerbates trauma in potentially exploitative ways. In contrast, the statues present eerily placid, static symbols of white authority. Videos are documentary in nature. They promise viewers access to the truth by enabling eyewitnessing. The statues, in contrast, are mythologizing, distancing. They rewrite and often obscure historical events by dressing them in classical costume. Lastly, viral videos seem like the medium of the moment. They're contemporary. They circulate through broadcast media as well as YouTube and Twitter. And it seems only natural that videos should be the medium most capable of instigating political awareness and action today. In contrast, monuments are located in physical space. They're historic. They rely on what Eloy Riegel called age value. And this gives them the aspect of being artifacts of a bygone era of representation. Indeed, since at least the 1950s, architectural critics from Louis Mumford to more recently Mario Carpo have pointed out that the age of monuments has passed. As Carpo wrote in a 2007 essay, quote, architectural monuments, which were a vital component of European intellectual life at the end of the 19th century, are only marginal cultural players at the end of the 20th, close quote. It's no wonder then that we in the world of architecture and beyond might find it relatively easy to give up on these monuments. It's no wonder that the Society of Architectural Historians, I think, very rightly adopted a policy this summer supporting the removal of these monuments from public spaces. Not only do they seem to speak to the unacceptable racist values of a past era, but they speak in a past language, the language of figural representation in bronze and granite. If monuments have a utility for politics today, it seems to be primarily as symbolic objects of iconoclastic destruction, agonistic objects over which a divided public debates. And yet, we, and by we I mean not just we in the United States, American society, but also specifically we modern architects, we're still making monuments today. In 2018, less than a year after the Charlottesville protests, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice opened in Montgomery, Alabama. Created by the Equal Justice Initiative, a civil rights organization founded by Bryan Stevenson, the memorial commemorates the over 4,000 African-American men, women, and children that we know of who were lynched by whites in the United States between 1877 and 1950. And I can cite another memorial that opened recently, the UVA Memorial to Enslaved Laborers, designed by Howler and Yoon. So I want to think about this Memorial for Peace and Justice today and use it as a kind of case study to consider what kind of political work monuments can do today and how they do it. Can contemporary monuments continue to spark reflection and action towards change? Or is the debate over monuments simply a distraction, part of a liberal politics of representation, obscuring the real issues of mass incarceration, police abolition, societal anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism? Designed by the firm Mass Design, the memorial takes the form of a square, open pavilion set in a park. Inside the pavilion, 800 stelae made of corten steel are suspended. Each one of these steel columns represents a county in which a lynching or lynchings took place. The dates and names, known or unknown, of the lynchings are engraved on each block. Outside the pavilion is a park that holds a set of duplicate stelae that the Equal Justice Initiative has invited individual counties to claim and install. So in this way, the memorial asks communities to confront and grapple with their own history. When you visit the memorial, as a visitor, the path is it goes down a ramp. And at the beginning of the path, the steel blocks rest on or near the ground, making you aware of their scale. They're 6 feet high, similar to an adult male body. As you descend down the ramp, the stelae get higher in relation to you until they're hanging ominously above you. And this gives a more disturbing aspect to the metaphor of the body. The Memorial for Peace and Justice, sometimes called the Lynching Memorial, can be related to several developments in monument design in the second half of the 20th century. As historians like Kirk Savage have written, this period saw a distinct change in the modes of monument building. We see a shift from heroic monuments to victim memorials that commemorate not heroes, but those whose lives were torn apart by war and unjust violence. These latter memorials tend to adopt a therapeutic rather than a triumphalist tone. Their purpose is to provoke mourning or reflection rather than respect or awe. And the lynching memorial is also part of a broad trend towards memorials that are spatial rather than sculptural, and hence many of them are designed by architects rather than sculptors, as they were in the 19th century. So many of these newer memorials produce not just encounters with an object, but a more comprehensive experience, or to use a rather cliched term, a kind of journey, often correlated with elevational change. Hence, you see a lot of ramps in contemporary spatial memorials. Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which opened in 1982, in many ways can be credited with inaugurating this new kind of therapeutic memorial. Created to commemorate a much contested war, it was designed not to glorify, idealize, or justify, but instead to help the nation heal, as the architect put it. Lin herself called this an anti-monument, something that negated traditional monumentality. On the right, you see the original competition boards. The design of the memorial was strikingly understated. Its main feature consisted of 2 long polished granite walls inscribed with the names of every American killed in the war. And this idea of including all of the names of those killed was a kind of first in memorial design. In describing the monument, Lin wrote that, quote, "The meaning was to be generated by the viewers themselves in their experience of the place." The idea that a work of art should be extremely restrained in its form in order to heighten the perceiver's experience. This is a kind of hallmark of minimalist art of the 70s, which was a clear influence on Lin. In emphasizing individual experience, she was, in a way, attempting to remove some of the political charge from the space. So the memorial is not about whether US involvement in the war was right or wrong. Instead, it emphasizes a private experience of loss. And so, the way that people typically visit this, one of the things that people do is they bring a piece of paper and graphite and take a rubbing of a name of a loved one. So as is well known, Lin's design was kind of starkly modern, and it met with opposition. Many veterans saw the design as a scar on the earth, as disrespectful of their sacrifices, and positing a nihilistic message. So as a concession to these views, a second artist, Frederick Hart, was commissioned to create a sculpture of 3 soldiers to be erected near the memorial alongside a flagpole. In the story of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial reception, we can see a conflict over competing modes of representation and the political work that memorials are supposed to do, over whether a memorial should produce an affective, emotional experience of mourning through an architectural spatial design, or in some way idealize the common soldier through figural representation. Oops. Another obvious precedent for the National Memorial for Peace and Justice is Peter Eisenman's monument to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin. As in Montgomery, a field of stelae is the centerpiece. Here, 2,711 gray concrete blocks distributed over 4.5 acres. The lynching monument borrows one of the Holocaust Memorial's most powerful techniques, which is to use abstraction and quantification to impress on spectators the horror of the historic events being evoked. Here, living beings are reduced to quantities, repetitive abstract volumes, therefore reminding us of the dehumanization entailed in the Holocaust's efficient technology of mass killing. Yet the Berlin Memorial is also full of metaphors. Blocks as individual life, field of blocks as graveyard, helping to ensure that viewers sort of get the message. And I think this speaks to how metaphor is a kind of unavoidable trope in monument design, even for someone as ostensibly hostile to narrative meaning as Eisenman. Now, Eisenman's memorial has also provoked controversy. There were those who found it too abstract and hence inadequate in communicating a clear historical message or lesson. Unlike the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, no victims' names were engraved. And one critic writing in the New Yorker objected to the memorial's failure to, quote, say anything about who did the murdering or why. Its abstraction and semiotic openness has perhaps lent it also to appropriation and what many would consider misuse. So the memorial today often appears on Instagram as a place for dramatic selfies. In response to the demands for more historical interpretation to accompany the site, an underground information center was added over the architect's objections. In explaining why he didn't want more text in the memorial landscape itself, Eisenman said, "The world is too full of information, and here is a place without information. That's what I wanted." In place of information and narrative, Eisenman's monument prioritizes spatial effects. With its undulating ground and the wave-like variation in the height of the blocks, the memorial landscape presents a disorienting spatial experience. One colleague of mine described visiting and the haunting sensation of losing sight of one's friends and kids among the forest of stelae. Now, this turn to abstraction and spatial experience can be linked to two trajectories or two sort of frameworks for understanding modernist abstraction, one stemming from architecture and the other from art. So I'll kind of sketch this out just very quickly. Within architecture, this tendency towards abstraction draws on a tradition of modernist emphasis on spatial experience that goes back to 19th century German empathy theory, a body of philosophical and psychological investigations into how subjects projected their feelings onto objects and spaces, and vice versa, how spaces and objects produce sensations in humans. In Berlin, an empathy theorist might say, the spectator feels with his or her body the heaviness of the concrete, experiences the narrowness of the alleys as a physical sense of constraint. And it's important to note that empathy theory in this early phase is not about feeling another person's emotions, but rather a sub-rational relation between subjects and physical objects or spaces. The Holocaust Memorial, like Lim's Vietnam Memorial, can also be understood as a descendant of minimalist art. And this lineage brings with it another set of critical connotations, which I think are useful to consider here. The art critic Michael Fried, in his essay Art and Objecthood of 1967, criticized abstract art for what he called its theatricality. What bothered Fried about minimalist art was that it required a different role for the beholder. Instead of the work of art being complete and absorbing the viewer into a kind of replete representation, minimalist art creates a spatial field in which the beholder is part of the work, and therefore becomes sort of self-conscious of their own position vis-a-vis the work. As Fried put it, quote, "Once the viewer is in the room, the work refuses obstinately to let him alone," which is to say, it refuses to stop confronting him, distancing him, isolating him. Similar effects seem to be at work in the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. Visitors and critics have invariably noted the visceral emotional impact of the monument. One New York Times op-ed writer described the sensation of walking through the monument this way, quote, "There are no more names, only a growing pressure on your chest as you try to absorb the scope of it all." So there's a kind of echo here of empathy theory, the idea of the effect of the objects on your, physical sense of your body. But also a kind of self-conscious response. Unlike in Berlin, the organizers of the lynching memorial also chose to supplement that spatial experience with information and other traditional elements of memorials. At the site, a visitor will find well-worn techniques such as the inspirational epigraph, the water wall, the commemorative poem. A wall of plaques features one-sentence epitaphs of the victims of lynching. William Miller was lynched in Brighton, Alabama in 1908 for organizing local coal miners. Warren Powell, 14, was lynched in East Point, Georgia in 1889 for frightening a white girl. The specificity, brevity of these texts, the disproportion between the supposed offenses and the violence they instigated are undeniably powerful. In addition to the textual supplements, the memorial site also features a number of figural sculptures commissioned by EJI. The first sculpture one encounters after leaving the entry kiosk is the Ghanaian artist Kwame Akoto Bamfo's ensemble of 6 shackled figures depicted in various poses of strain and anguish. The presence of these sculptures raises questions that several art historians have discussed regarding figural representations of enslavement and the role of simulation and empathy. I have to confess, when I saw these, I felt kind of uncomfortable, and I wasn't sure whether I was meant to feel sympathy for these figures, to kind of empathize with their anguish, or feel anger at the people, the society that would allow this, scene to occur. And I found the sculpture a bit, if I can admit it, like maudlin, to the degree that I was sort of more alienated than moved by it. Another sculpture, Raise Up, by Hank Willis Thomas, produced, I think, a more empathetic response in the German sense in me. A series of men, apparently based on a historic photo of striking South African miners, stand submerged in a concrete block. Their pose, with arms raised, evokes the slogan, "Hands up, don't shoot," popularized after Michael Brown's killing in Ferguson. Their eyes are closed, preventing any easy identification between figure and viewer. I felt a sense of both weight and entrapment, but also lightness, as I considered whether the bodies were sinking or levitating. I thought about the resonances between historic lynchings and contemporary police shootings. Overall, the memorial, with its combination of abstract, textual, and sculptural elements, produces an experience that could be described as theatrical in the sense described by Fried. As a visitor, you become unavoidably aware of your own demeanor, your own racial identity, and how that shapes your response. I found myself asking, would I respond differently to these sculptures if I were Black? Or how would I feel about this site if I were white? You become very self-conscious about the other people around you. And sort of, as in a funeral, you sort of, start to think about, am I exhibiting the proper demeanor? Am I taking too many photographs? Is taking photographs too touristic? Is it disrespectful? So, the monument itself provokes this discomforting self-consciousness, as well as a hyper-awareness of your own performative participation in the site. Now, similar to the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, the lynching memorial also grapples with questions about whether an aesthetic spatial experience is enough, or does it need to be supplemented with narrative in order to become properly political? The answer to this question comes in the form of the Legacy Museum, which is a museum also operated by the Equal Justice Initiative that is located about a mile from the memorial. The museum features several slickly produced exhibits on the history of white supremacy and racial violence in the United States, from the slave trade to the present, with a special emphasis on the continuity between Jim Crow era policies and contemporary mass incarceration. And all of this is directly related to the work of the EJI, which provides direct advocacy for incarcerated individuals and is dedicated to ending mass incarceration. If the memorial is about spatial empathy, provoking an emotional journey, the museum combines didacticism and presentation of historical information with what might be described as edutainment. Here, history is packaged in accessible visual and textual bites designed for popular reception. Well, making the past comprehensible and engaging to non-historians is an important function of public history. Some of the techniques here are, I guess, raise questions. So in one of the first exhibits, you enter a darkened room with reconstructed slave pens. And this museum sits on the site of a building where enslaved people were held. So they've reconstructed these slave pens, and then as a visitor, you sort of look through the bars and you can see projected holograms of actors playing enslaved people, and they're speaking. And in one cell, a woman pleads, "Help me find my children." Another exhibit features reproductions of prison visitor booths. And as a visitor, you pick up a receiver, and this activates a video of a real inmate recorded who's telling his or her story. The inmate stories are compelling and informative, as are the other displays and documentary evidence and videos. Yet some of these exhibits steer perilously close to a kind of ersatz quality that undermines, I think, their effectiveness. I was reminded of an observation that Saidiya Hartman makes in her essay, The Time of Slavery, in which she writes about visiting a Mina Castle, a famous trading stop and holding site for enslaved Africans in what is now Ghana. She asks whether imagined and simulated captivity doesn't in fact operate to contrary purposes, minimizing the very terror it sets out to represent through mundane reenactments. The Haitian scholar Michel Rolph Triot takes up similar questions in his book Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History, where he describes a proposal by the Disney Corporation in the 1990s to build a theme park called Disney's America that would have included exhibits on slavery, an idea that was roundly criticized at the time. Triot discusses the perils of trivialization and inauthenticity entailed by this plan. For Triot, however, the greatest danger is not the problem of distorting the past. Instead, it's the risk of protecting visitors from a racist present by casting slavery as historical. As he writes, quote, the denunciation of slavery in a presentist mode is easy. Slavery was bad. Most of us would agree. To condemn slavery alone is the easy way out. What needs to be denounced here to restore authenticity is much less slavery than the racist present with which representations of slavery are produced. The Legacy Museum is acutely aware of this danger, simply offering viewers a moving experience of the racist past without connecting these feelings to present-day action. So it therefore concludes its sequence with a direct appeal for visitors to take what they have felt and learned and to translate it into activism. So in the final room before the exit are these interactive screens that answer the visitor's natural question at the end of all of this, which is, what do I do now? So you can sit down at one of these screens and the program lets you enter your zip code, and you can find a list of peace and justice organizations in your hometown and even enter your email to be added to their lists. So to conclude here, how does a memorial translate emotion into politics, trauma into activism? Is that the proper aim of a memorial? In recent years, thinkers such as Lauren Berlant and Sarah Ahmed have questioned the way that sentiment and bad feelings are deployed in political discourse. One of the appeals of a politics of feeling, Berlant writes, is its supposed clarity and universal accessibility. Everyone can empathize with the trauma of subordinated groups. We're all ultimately human beings. The politics of feeling, she writes, appear, quote, beyond ideology, beyond mediation, beyond contestation. It seems to dissolve contradiction and dissent into pools of basic and also higher truth. It seems strong and clear as opposed to confused or ambivalent. Yet, as Ahmed points out, feelings such as empathy and sadness are often aroused in ways that result in quiescence rather than in political activism. Feeling bad about a historical trauma too frequently substitutes for action to overcome everyday structural violence. Reflecting on her experience of Elmina Castle, Saidiya Hartman writes, quote, "Is acting out the past the best approximation of working through the past available to us? By suffering the past, are we better able to grasp hold of an elusive freedom and make it substantial? Is pain the guarantee of compensation? Beyond contemplating injury or apportioning blame, how can this encounter with the past fuel emancipatory efforts? Is there a necessary relation between remembrance and redress? Can the creation of a collective memory of past crimes ensure the end of injustice?" Close quote. Now, this is clearly what the EJI is trying to avoid at the Lag-Sing Museum and the Lynching Monument, where the links between historical and contemporary institutional violence are powerfully highlighted, and where visitors are immediately invited to translate their feelings into action. So just to wrap up, I want to return to where I began by comparing the power of the video with that of the monument. Videos of racist acts have had an incredibly important role in bringing to consciousness, particularly the consciousness of non-Black folks, the everyday terror and racism that Black people experience. Videos, with their documentary truth-telling quality, can have a revelatory and an incendiary effect. They can produce an eruptive politics. They magnify the urgency and immediacy of long simmering demands, leading to bold and symbolically powerful acts of iconoclasm, the metaphorical and sometimes literal tearing down of structures and signs of white supremacy. Monuments and memorials, in contrast, have a different temporality. Whereas videos by nature are immaterial and ephemeral and hence always in danger of lasting only as long as it takes for a new viral video to appear, monuments are physical and therefore slower. Because they're made of granite, steel, and concrete, they're one generation's way of speaking insistently to future generations. They do this by simply taking up space, intrusively and obdurately. Monuments have a tendency to persist until another generation decides they shouldn't. As Berlant, Ahmed, and Hartman point out, the danger of monuments is that by staging the confrontation with history as an exceptional experience, viewers can go, feel solemn for an hour or a day, and then return home and be complacent because they've grappled with history, they've felt the pain, and now they're done. The true test of such monuments is whether the discomfort and awareness they provoke remains in the body afterward, ready to be activated in the not too distant future. Monuments, like the knowledge of history, are slow. They can take time to seep in, and this might just be part of their power. Thanks.
Thank you. If we want to turn it over to Richard.
Hello. First, I want to thank Lydia and Nadir and Stephen for inviting me, and thank Irene for sending me an earlier version of this talk some weeks ago that was very provoked a lot of thinking and what you're going to hear in my response. I can't help thinking now that hearing this that it might have made sense to go in the other order, because Irene spoke very convincingly about recent phenomena, and I'm going to kind of reach farther back in history, especially into some deep Americana, considering this is what I work on, but also I think it's timely given the election coming up. So I'm going to get started. I won't actually move into slides until a little bit, so I'll just, am I set up to share the screen when I need to? I'll just do it myself.
You can go ahead and share the screen, yes.
Okay. So Irene has raised some essential questions about what she has called the spatial turn in monument making, or the shift from what some might think of as a neoclassical or object-oriented approach to the monument, to one that expands to other architectural and media-based forms, even to things like video. She has probed the role that empathy and emotion plays in engaging various publics with these new forms of monument, and asked really important questions about the contemporary monument's capacity to spur or not spur political and social change. I want to build on this and begin by focusing on one aspect of the argument, or maybe that's sort of under the argument that or the issues that she's raised, as a way to upend certain binds of form and content that play out in architecture, in the architecture and aesthetics of monument making, and show how these binds between form and content condition the monument's political effects. So recent debates about keeping, removing, or reforming controversial monuments raise a vexing question. Why does it matter, and why aren't there more important things to be fighting for? The worry or accusation about contemporary approaches to existing monuments or the creating of new monuments is that monument making or unmaking may be merely another expression of a liberal politics of representation. A politics of representation that substitutes symbols and signs and the feelings they evoke for more instrumental forms of social action and political change. This questioning of the monument's relevance is not new, especially in an American context and more broadly in the history of modern architecture. And Irene mentioned the kind of new monumentality, the arguments of Mumford, a number of people in the middle of the century who were grappling with this issue. But before we get into that, I want to capsule the contours of what I think the current argument against monuments is as a departure point. The first aspect of this argument is that it is clearly easier to remove the name of a problematic patriarch from a building or topple the statue of a racist oppressor, and maybe even replace it with something that acknowledges the agony and repressed history of victims than it is to actualize institutional change and shift real power and resources to those who have been oppressed. The more salient aspects of this critique is that the very act of creating empathic monuments to help the public understanding of oppression may itself be a form of false consciousness, in that it provides a liberal alibi, compensation, substitute for doing something more material to address real inequities that still exist in society today. My collaborator, Glenn Forley, and I have been teaching a class at Cooper Union entitled Architectures of Time, Making Over the Monument. And our students have been very strong and vocal in raising just these kinds of questions. For example, some of them asked very early on in the class if new policies and commitments that would lead to more and better housing aren't more important than making or remaking monuments. So I'm sympathetic to this way of thinking, yet I think we need to examine the assumptions that underlie this line of thinking and logic. When we make a distinction between monuments and instruments, if you will, and this is a terminology that was actually used in the middle of the 20th century, or to put it another way, as architects and designers think we must choose between making symbols or producing tools, we are rehearsing some of the most dogmatic and ultimately misconstrued aspects of the functionalist tradition in architecture. So one goal of this discussion this evening is for me to bring this false dichotomy between the monument and the instrument to the surface and show the way in which the monument is actually an instrument and how monument making might open minds and change lives. So now I'm going to bring up the slides. Give me a second here. Can everyone see my screen? Yes. Okay. So I want to frame this discussion in terms of our discipline by saying that we tend to think of the classical or antique monument as the counterpoint to the spatial turn Irene has referred to. But the pre-modern monument is something actually much more complex. At least in the history of the United States, the way in which the neoclassical monument was adopted already represented a split between form and content that we can still see being explored in the changing organizational schemes of monuments up to today. I don't want to resort to a complicated semiotic argument, but simply wish to remind everyone that the power of the monument in antiquity depended on the joining of the token, if you will, or the formal vessel, and the message or the text. The ornament on Trajan's column tells a story that spirals up to the heavens, which its vertical form facilitates. The Trajan column's impact depends on the marriage of the text, ornament, and the column, as you see in the slide. Compare this to the Bunker Hill Monument, the first significant and largest monument to be built in the United States in its time, in the middle of the 19th century. The former Bunker Hill was inspired by a scheme first proposed by Horatio Greenough, one of the fathers, if you will, of modern functionalism. The Bunker Hill Monument is stripped bare of text and ornament, which is perhaps why a postcard image of it was among the prized souvenirs Adolf Loos brought back from his trip to America at the end of the 19th century when he was just 23 years old. And I just want you to note, because this is going to come up a lot in the things I'm going to show, the Bunker Hill Monument, and then this later built kind of little museum that sits next to it. So I want you to hold this question in your mind. What stands in for or takes the place of the text or conveys the story, myth, or narrative in a modern monument? I want to not only ask what in many cases stands in for the text, but what it means or takes to change the message or content of a modern monument. Because I think this is the key to undoing this dichotomy between monument and instrument. Now, I want to take you through some cases, and I'm actually going to have I may have fewer words, but a lot more slides than Irene. I want to take you through some cases to help sort this out, cases where conveying the idea or message of the monument often requires not only something different or extra to a text, but often the creation of a formal frame or vessel that differs from a classical or Platonic marker. Or to put it another way, what decoupling of the text or content from the form of the monument opens up in terms of a possible reconfiguration of the monument. Irene spoke about the National Memorial to Peace and Justice, a project that addresses a history of discrimination and violent oppression based on race and human subjugation. As Irene indicates, it's hard to disagree with a project that repositions the Southern Confederacy and redresses a tragic history of racism and oppression, just as it is hard to defend maintaining Confederate monuments that were intentionally mounted to assert white hegemony in the Jim Crow South, as is the case with many, if not most, Confederate monuments. Yet the monuments my partner Glenn and I have been studying are expressions of actually a much more ambiguous history and politics, and we intentionally exclude, for example, war-based memorials in an effort to focus on more prospective forms of monument making. Our focus has been on American monuments devoted to ostensibly democratic themes such as freedom, liberty, unfettered mobility, and the various founding myths that underlie America's claimed being exceptional within world history. And we're interested in how these themes are often intentionally conflated with other, more problematic ideas in monuments that celebrate America's colonial founding, its manifest destiny, the pioneering of the frontier, and its continuing exceptionalism. So one need only mention monuments such as Plymouth Rock, Mount Rushmore, or the Jefferson Arch and Museum of Westward Expansion in St. Louis, or other phenomena Glenn and I identify as monuments such as the Appalachian Trail, to conjure the many conflicts and equations between indigenous understandings of land and sovereignty, colonialism, and white supremacy that are part of the troubled creation and legacy that a wide array of American monuments participate in. So again, we're teaching this course at the Cooper Union, and we're asking the students to engage in an exercise we call Too Big to Fall. It's a little bit of a play on Too Big to Fail, the response to the Wall Street crash of a decade ago. So we're asking what we might do to address the kinds of monuments that are not so easy to simply endorse or reject. Whatever we might think of such monuments, they're unlikely to fall anytime soon. We plan to make this the subject, actually, of an exhibition we're going to work on with Stephen. So I want to trace the origins of a profound spatial turn in American monument making, beginning with one of the what I call the monuments of American democracy, Independence Hall in Philadelphia. It's so ubiquitous you might not have noticed it's on the back of the $100 bill, and this is a site where the American Republic was arguably founded, and where the Declaration of Independence on the $2 bill that is still in circulation. The Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution were drafted and signed. So I've written a long exegesis about Independence Hall from its origins in the 18th century to the creation of the modern Independence Mall that was later created to reframe the hall in the 20th century, a kind of, in a way, a new monumentality project, if you will. It's worth noting that many political figures, just a little sidebar here, this is a very famous drawing by Louis Kahn in Philadelphia from his traffic studies in the early 50s. And you'll see, some of you will know this project with these kind of car parking citadels. But you'll see in this drawing, every building in the entire former colonial footprint of Philadelphia is removed except one, which is Independence Hall right here. You can see my arrow. And this is actually the figure of the mall, which was only later, which was much later. Something was taken up by Edmund Bacon. So this mall and this hall is actually used fairly often by various especially used fairly often by President Obama, who chose to hold rallies on the mall. And to make major speeches from the Constitution Center that's built there. And you see this is a picture with Obama and Clinton from 4 years ago at the close of the last presidential election. Here he is speaking at another time with the mall behind him. And here you see on the left a recent protest on the mall with one of the favorite placards that I've seen in a while. Not voting causes unwanted presidencies. But also it's a site of kind of media projection. This is just last Sunday, Chris Christie and Rahm Emanuel debating from the Constitution Center. But like most of the so-called heritage sites, Independence Hall was created out of a myth that evolved over time, and certain moments in the pre-formation of this monument are instructive. Some of you might know this very famous painting by Charles Willson Peale, a fascinating figure from the early 19th century, one of these kind of Enlightenment polymaths who was a scientist, a painter, an entrepreneur. And you see in this painting the mastodon that he unearthed in Newburgh, New York, that he displayed in what was the first natural history museum in the country, which he mounted in the second floor of Independence Hall. In this long room. The mammoth actually couldn't have been in that scene, but you see the long room. After the government sort of vacated Independence Hall for I think Harrisburg, and then briefly New York, and then Washington, he took over and mounted this Natural History Museum. What's fascinating though is actually to look at the sketch that he did, or the drawing of the actual museum in the long hall, because what you see here is that he organized the kind of natural history of America, if you will, according to a Linnaean chart, or the Linnaean system of natural species. And you see that on the bottom of this view. And then on the top, there's a frieze with his paintings of all of the great founding fathers, right? So this is a kind of spatial index, if you will, an argument for the exceptional nature of the American continent, because of course it was the American project and the American nation, because it was less than a century old when this space was made. Yet he's here trying to make an equation between the vast natural inheritance of the country and the exceptional nature of its human founders, right? So this is, one of the portraits that would have been up there of Benjamin Franklin, and then this Linnaean system of classification. And this is a kind of fascinating, He organized this museum. It actually had a kind of Noah's Ark like zoo in the courtyard, and it was a popular amusement. In fact, when they eventually broke up the Natural History Museum that Peale and then his son remounted in Baltimore later, half of it was sold to the Peabody Museum, History Museum at Harvard, and the other half went to Barnum and Bailey. So you have this idea of the magic lantern, where they would have these projections in this space. I'm putting this forward because these are all ingredients of what I would say becomes a kind of art of monument making more up to now. Of course, the magic lantern is an interesting, almost pre-film, pre-video medium. This is from the 17th century. So. But to continue on with these conjunctions, if you will, that are the foundation of the American monument, we have here the Hamilton Monument, which literally positions the founding father on a rock as a prospect towards the great city he helped create. In fact, there was a proposal that Manhattan would be called Hamiltonia at one point. And there's another view of this version of the monument where the monument actually looks on the Palisades and a prospect over to Manhattan. And there's a quote from Daniel Webster about, I won't read the whole thing, but this is the best part. He smote the rock of the natural resources and abundant streams of revenue gushed forth. So Hamilton is seen as this figure in juxtaposition to Jefferson as sort of organizing the industrial might of the United States through mining and resource extraction. Moving along, we have, I'm going to move through the rocks pretty quickly. This is, the Plymouth Rock is another fascinating American monument that has this, started with an oral history where, some so-called first comer before the American Revolution argued that, the Pilgrims stepped on this rock and it can't be destroyed or they can't build things over it. And eventually, this is actually the kind of craggy rock coast in Plymouth, or a depiction of it. And this rock has this fascinating history. It actually gets split in half because the residents of Plymouth who are siding with the revolutionaries and the ones that side with the British disagree. So the rebels break off the rock and form their own sort of frame for the monument. And then you see this hole in this wharf where that leftover piece of the monument of the rock is. Then later they build this kind of romantic 19th century kind of Baldessore that had relics of the Pilgrims in it, and people could come and chip off a piece of the rock in this thing. Here you see a view of that. And slowly Plymouth becomes more of a kind of tourist draw. And then in the 20th century, as part of the colonial revival, there's an effort to erase the industrial the industrial treatment of Plymouth's waterfront. And a scheme by McKim, Mead, and White. You see on the left the wharfs that existed on the right. This kind of pastoral scheme with a new pavilion proposed for the center and then you see it from McKim, Mead, and White, and that's what exists today, where they re-enshrine the two pieces of the rock back on the coast in this kind of grotto-like condition under the monument. I won't get into all the other sundry things that supplement the rock in terms of the storytelling on the Pilgrims, if only to say that there was this is part of the colonial revival, which was really somewhat xenophobic movement, because in fact Plymouth was more and more occupied by immigrants, by Italian immigrants, and there's a kind of interesting relation between the Sacco and Vanzetti trial and kind of labor movements and this attempt to kind of erase and remake the waterfront of Plymouth using the rock. And of course, there are all sorts of pageants and events that were put on to inaugurate it. This is a cartoon from life at the time landing of the Pilgrims as it might have been. You see it's depicting cliched images of Jews and Italians as what it would have been at the time, because of the actual nature of the population in Plymouth. Of course, this site has been a site of protest, and I would argue that while one doesn't want to necessarily get rid of the rock, it may be due for a resetting, as it has been reset many times. Another sort of monument too big to fall, Mount Rushmore, which has to be understood not only as the kind of carved rock. Of course, the original idea for this thing by a figure named Doane was not to actually have the presidents, but was to have the heroes of the American West: George Custer, Buffalo Bill Cody, Lewis and Clark, and the Oglala Lakota leader Red Cloud. They were supposed to be the figures, but it's also part of a kind of tourist scenic drive and network. And again, this is something I'm emphasizing with this series of things. You have this kind of carving of the great patriarchs looking west, and it was supposed to also include a hall of records, which was supposed to contain the Declaration of Independence and the great documents, like a kind of national archive that would be that would house all the great documents of American democracy, embalming them for eternity, right? And it was started but not finished. So this scheme of sort of separating the monument from where the text or where the message is repeats over and over again. This is one we may be more familiar with from the 1970s, great project by Venturi and Roach at the time, the Benjamin Franklin House and Visitor Center, which is part of the Independence Hall National Park. It also includes the Independence Hall, and you see, this somewhat famous project by Venturi, where he does this Giacometti-like move of framing the figure of where the Franklin House was, and then putting all the pedagogical material underground with these kind of light scoops. I won't go into this in any detail because Irene covered it extremely well, if only to say that the Eisenman project has the same scheme in a sense. He was forced to include it, so he pushed the kind of storytelling and the documentary part of the project under it. I might have a lot to say about this project, but I think we can leave that to this discussion. I want to move from this series of geological projects to ones that are more about celebrating a different idea of American heritage, and this is a project we're looking at a lot in the class. What was originally called the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial and Westward Expansion Museum. Now it's called the Saarinen Arch, or the Gateway Arch. And this is a project like many mid-century, and I would say still even today, monument projects that use a kind of political theme as a cover for a kind of urban renewal infrastructure project. So here's some of the material that was developed starting in the 1920s and 30s to argue for this project, which would reposition St. Louis, which had lost its primacy to Chicago with the system where the trains switched there. St. Louis had been the central city of the middle of the country because of the Mississippi and the switching of shipping from there out. And when the railroad bypassed it, it lost its primacy. And this is part of a project to sort of rev up the city. So the early version of it was this Beaux-Arts project, which is really a kind of an infrastructure project to remake the front of the city. They tore down 48 blocks based on this idea of the scheme. This one, of course, was never built because by the time that the Second World War happened, this kind of neoclassical architecture, this kind of bombastic Beaux-Arts imposition became less plausible after the kind of architecture of totalitarianism. and that's where the kind of new monumentality comes in. So this is a sheet from the competition for that project. These are, it was both Irene and very importantly, the landscape architect Dan Kiley that did these schemes. And I just want to point out the early scheme for the arch had these kind of displays, these series of dioramas trying to describe westward expansion in the American landscape in miniature, which eventually got kind of pushed out. But you see them. This isn't a great resolution here, but you see these outside rooms that were in the original competition. And this plan, the kind of fascinating plan about what I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes, of the trail, this trail that I believe Kiley conceived, where they kept a number of fragments of historical buildings, and the grounds were supposed to have this kind of trail that took you through these fragments under the umbrella of the arch. This is all kind of washed out eventually for this much more kind of minimalist scheme that you see here. There's a lot of reasons for that. What was also washed out from the original Beaux-Arts scheme was a project that was supposed to bridge and connect the waterfront to the city. They were unable to deal with the highway that sits here. But you see in this projected view and then in the built condition that they were very much thinking in terms of something which would look like in a way, a traditional monument, right? Or an obelisk from certain angles. And the transformation of the arch is really through its kind of exuberance and let's say technological sublime, and it's wrapped in steel and its paraboloid shape. Of course, all those things they were going to do on the surface in the landscape get pushed underground into this Museum of Western Expansion. So it's kind of repressed, if you will, under, right? You have to go under and then come up into the arch. Something our students actually brought to light, which we had not been so aware of, is that while the arch was being built, there was a protest because the construction workers and all the contracts. St. Louis is an incredibly racially divided city, and there were no black people allowed to work on the site. And there's a fairly famous protest where two figures climbed up the arch before it was finished. They were forced to come down, and this figure, Percy Green, I think he's still alive, still active, basically went limp on the ground and had to be removed from the site on a stretcher in an ambulance. So another aspect of the arch and this dynamic of monuments being part of a kind of infrastructural reimagining of cities in an instrumental way is that the arch was being conceived and built at the same time as another very famous project, which is part of the larger attempt to remake St. Louis, the Pewitt-Igoe housing project. And you may know that Pewitt-Igoe was originally conceived in a racially divided St. Louis, where Pewitt was a white figure and Igoe was, I think I have this right, was a black figure, and it was supposed to have, white people in some buildings and black people in others. And right before it was finished, they were forced to desegregate, and because of white flight and many other things, there were very few. White people never moved into Pewitt-Igoe, and there's an amazing documentary from about 6 years ago that actually explains the nature of the failure here. But what's interesting is that these two things, I think it's hard to say that one's an infrastructure or a kind of instrument and one's a monument, because in fact, Pewitt-Igoe was supposed to hold a lot of symbolic capital as a kind of as a model project of social renewal. But what's also going on here is that the racial divides and racial politics of St. Louis had a lot to do with the great migration from the south of people looking for work in the more industrialized north. So Pewitt-Igoe maps this migration that's actually happening at the time, whereas the arch is mythologizing the westward expansion of the kind of this kind of east to west expansion, and they're both kind of competing for resources and and you know which one got it. So this very famous, the famous destruction, the tearing down of Hewitt-Igo is interesting because it happens at the time, almost simultaneous with the construction and completion of the arch. Within 10 years, there's a whole fascinating series of photographs by Joel Meyerowitz that sort of captures the decrepit quality, the failure in a sense of these urban renewal projects to renew St. Louis, and he takes them in this very canny way where all the arch appears in all of them, almost like in a Where's Waldo way. So, in the remaining time, I want to try and pull this argument together by insisting that for monument making to have currency today, it must ultimately contend with the problem of democracy. And by democracy, I don't mean a fixed philosophy or some universal that can be politically applied evenly throughout the world, but rather an evolving struggle for human emancipation and something we aspire to rather than ever fully achieve. As the scholar Chantal Mouffe has stressed, democracy is agonistic in its nature, and this agonism is a necessary aspect of achieving it. So, if following the Benjaminian formulation, we accept the cultural monuments of the past were put up to celebrate the heroes of history, that is, the victors, thereby vanquishing the victims, then the democratically conceived monument is obliged to change that equation. The democratic monument requires positing a new truth, a reconciling with the past, but by reconciling ourselves with a changed understanding of the past, it opens the possibility or other possibilities for the future. So how does monument making change in the scenario I've been drawing? I'm just going to go very quickly. So in a sense, rather than accept a false opposition between the monument and the instrument, where symbols, stories, and embodied myths are taken as being merely passive, I think it's essential to rethink the temporal and geographic dimensions of the monument. Despite the rhetoric of the neoclassical monument as being something timeless, monuments rise and monuments fall because they exist in time. I think Irene spoke to this. They even have a kind of generational life. Monuments recast time, and in particular, in the particular history of monument making in America, they do so by engaging and mapping the landscape. Democratic monument making, I would argue, is a topographic art. It has to be connected to the shape and contours of a social and physical geography. So this way of thinking requires us to expand the range, type, and scale of things we consider to be among the tools, sites, and media of monument making. Most important monuments originate as events and performances, and we see this in the relation between monuments and things like pageants, parades, protest marches, world's fairs, historical reenactments, and various forms of living history, both documentary and theatrical. To these I would add more recent phenomena such as environmental, performance, and for lack of a better phrase, pedagogical works of art. As the late scholar David Lowenthal argued so eloquently, history is not just made by historians, but often grows out of popular forms of architecture, theater, fiction writing, tourism, and film. And it's not just human beings that possess histories, but a whole world of objects. So I'm not going to be brief. One of the things we've looked at in some detail is this river pageant called the Hudson Fulton Celebration, which was meant to celebrate the double anniversary, the and then the 400-year and 100-year anniversary in 1909 of Fulton's invention of so-called invention of the steamboat technology and Hudson's founding of the Hudson River Valley. And you see this postcard on the right where you have the past and the future brought together in all these mobility machines. This is part of an effort to actually set aside the Palisades along the Hudson as a national monument to compete with the West Coast monuments. And these are panoramas that were built as part of that, that were taken as a part of that effort. But the pageant itself had this kind of encapsulates a whole set of, let's say, forms that eventually become part of the arsenal of monument making. You see the floats, you see Wilbur Wright flying over the Hudson, you see these various parades, illumination. They had illumination events going from New York all the way up to Albany, illuminating the great monuments. This is, they had something called the Rhine Scintillator, which is a giant searchlight. This is before Albert Speer, with smoke that would create this kind of spectacle. And you see, Wright flew through the scintillator. This is all competing with the kind of allure of Coney Island and these popular, this is a kind of public pedagogy to kind of tell the story of New York as and the Hudson as actually the origin of arguing it for as the origin of the westward expansion, the kind of the industrial thrust of that. But they're using techniques drawn from popular culture, and there are all sorts of difficult and troubling things. You know, here you have all of the among the parades. They have, this is quote, colored children impersonating Indians. You had all these forms of pageant which were sometimes often quite confused. So this idea of the trail, this idea of the expanded topographic notion of the monument is best seen in the American context through this penchant for trails and trail making. The trail, whether it be pedestrian, horse, rail, or automobile-based, purposely combines a form of commemoration that is experiential and as a means for recreation that is social. Trail making constitutes an economically driven form of preservation, reclamation, and development. Of course, the notion of trailblazing, what were colonial acts of territorial conquest, expansion in the 19th century in the United States, has been central to the romanticizing of American exceptionalism. That is, the trail, which is to say, the trail is a highly politicized form linking a range of interests and phenomena in the American project. So you have this is from 1919, something called the Border Highway. Don't show Donald Trump that. And then all these other highways, Lincoln Highway, Dixie Highway, Jefferson Highway, Yellowstone Trail. But I thought it's interesting also to understand in this context that, again, to mix up fiction and fact, or well, those things are fiction as well, many of them. This idea, there's an atlas obscura of literary road trips. I want to call your attention to a few of them. There's the On the Road Jack Kerouac road trip, and there's the Cruise of the Rolling Jack, and then the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, which is actually the Merry Pranksters tour, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. There are other tours, or what we call trail tours, like the Freedom Train, which was a kind of rolling propaganda reliquary of American documents, and it originally conceived to compare the documents of German totalitarianism with American documents, but then it became a kind of Cold War effort. You see here with this kind of choice that the train proposes. So it traveled to 48 states, 329 cities. It was an incredibly popular and successful undertaking. Had a whole kind of set of pamphlets and things about how to be a good citizen, about voting, but a lot of it was quantifying the kind of bounty of American consumerism. And here you see people waiting to board the Freedom Train. Langston Hughes wrote a very famous, widely published, and then recorded poem asking where Black people's rights were on the Freedom Train, and in the middle of somewhere in the middle of the tour, they were forced to integrate it. It was guarded by an integrated army, and then it stopped being able to go to certain cities in the South that would not accept that. There's the Trail of Tears from the sort of marking the the sort of course of the Indian Removal Act from the 1830, but which wasn't established until 1968. There are things like the WPA guides to the states, a kind of where writers and amazing photographers were hired to describe and encapsulate all the states. These constitute a kind of trail in our view. And then there's the probably the most important trail in let's say in terms of architecture and landscape and planning, the Appalachian Trail, which was we shouldn't forget a regional plan. Benton McKay, who designed it, was actually in a family. He was the son of Percy McKay, who designed pageants and actually designed a pageant for Wild Bill's traveling show on the history of the United States. So, but Benton McKay was trained as a forester, was interested in environmentalism, and you see this whole way of describing the Appalachian Trail was really proposed as, with the closing of the frontier, as opening up a new frontier to kind of renew the pioneer spirit of American citizens in a kind of counter to the cosmopolitan condition, growing cosmopolitanism of the cities. And you see these comparisons between McKay makes between the kind of mountains of the metropolis and the mountains and grandeur of nature and its restorative abilities, and these juxtapositions, the metropolitan world and what he calls the indigenous world in terms of how the world operates. I can't go into a lot of detail here, but just to say that a lot of this was about reorganizing labor, was about the kind of growing, because timber workers were nomads in a sense. And this is a kind of project that brings in this whole history of tramping and idea of what dwelling or not dwelling is. And trying to, in a sense, elevate the wandering and movement through nature. Here, as you have all these kind of research on tramps from the 1920s, and the comparison of the kind of organization of labor, and then what's called the Jefferson Park intelligentsia, looking at the kind of life of the hobo. I bring this up because this history and this idea of wandering and being highly mobile is very important to the idea of the trail and to the kind of American psyche. And so one of the other kind of, let's say, proto tours and trails is the famous Mary Prankster's tours across the United States. It's interesting to note that the origin of this project and the term Murray Prankster was this fellow Ken Babb says, Casey and I and George Walker were out wandering, and around the rest of the gang were sitting around the fire in Casey's house in La Honda. We came back and it was dark, and Mike Hogan called out, "Halt, who goes there?" And just out of the blue I said, "'Tis I, the intrepid traveler, come to lead his merry band of pranksters across the nation. And they're in the reverse order of the pioneers. Our motto will be the obliteration of the entire nation. Not taken literally, of course. We won't blow up their buildings. We'll blow their minds." So you have this happening in the 1960s, at the same time that you have the civil rights movement also using infrastructure as a kind of site of protest. Of course, their fates were quite different, because while Kesey and his gang kept being arrested for drug possession, they had lawyers and they usually got out of this, whereas going out on the road and protesting for the civil freedom riders and civil rights worker was a lot more dangerous. And you see here a mob, hold on to that word, a mob attacking a bus with freedom rider protesters in Alabama and then burning the bus in 1961. So one of the most important trails, actually, and which is an official trail now, is the trail that marks the march from Selma to Montgomery. And this is a fascinating moment in history because the March from Selma to Montgomery was fought around the right to be on a highway, which they were not allowed to march on because there was a law saying you couldn't march on a highway. So that went to the Supreme Court in the same series of months that Lady Bird Johnson's project for highway beautification was also going through legislation and through the Highway Beautification Act. So you have these things playing out both in physical space and on the media. Here's King actually in Selma watching then President Johnson address the nation and the problem of the protests in Selma, and a kind of in a way the origin for a lot of our protest culture. And you see the way in which the police were thinking through this. But one very important aspect of all this is that what King was fighting for in the latter part of his, before he died, was workers' rights, was for resources for the Black community, and one of those was the paving of roads. And one of the realities is that in the South, Black people didn't have paved roads, and they weren't allowed to kick up dust, which meant that they couldn't travel in a way which would ever kick up dust on a white person. So the
Richard.
Yeah.
Hi. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I'm interrupting. Now, I took the opportunity of you catching your breath. We're already 2 hours in, and in order to leave some space for discussion, because I think there's a very important discussion that we need to.
I'll finish in about 5. Okay, I'm almost finished.
Okay, please, thank you.
So this idea of the kind of infrastructure in the road is extremely important. And if we come up to the present around this, I think it's a stretch to say that some of this work is about trail making, although Nona Faustein's project, called White Shoes, where she photographs herself at all of these sites throughout New York and kind of claims them through the sort of projection of her body, and then her related work in a way. Reframing monuments, I think, is very suggestive of this area. So I'm going to close with this with these thoughts. The substituting trail making for monument making merges two persistent themes in American culture: mobility and pragmatism, with the arguably more politically contested and historically contingent practice of democracy. When the when Utah Republican Senator Mike Lee recently stated just last week about the United States that we're not a democracy, democracy isn't the objective, liberty, peace, and prosperity are, and that we want the human condition to flourish and rank democracy can thwart that, he was articulating a long simmering tension in American politics. That the right sees democracy merely as something that can facilitate the freedom to pursue one's happiness and prosperity, and they see mobility, both physical mobility and socioeconomic mobility, as one of the keys to this. But it's curious to know that the origins of the term mobility in Europe was as a noun. It was the mobility, and it was posed in relationship to the idea of nobility. And in fact, the term mob comes from the term mobility. So we'll want to think about that. Of course, the left sees democracy more in terms of increasing human rights and the institutional and political forms of representation that give a voice, increase access, and power to a wide range of the populace in their quest to have their needs met and rights respected. The trail is a powerful form of monument because it trades in both these competing ideas of democracy, engaging citizens in an experiential way. In a diverse geography whose populace is disaggregated across a rather vast continent, the trail pragmatically meets citizens where they live. So I want to just close with this project in New York it was a Robert Moses project. He meant to build war memorials actually in all of the boroughs. This is, I think, the only one that's built. My collaborator Glenn happened upon not this, but this very curious piece, which is they wanted to build these monuments, but each of them had a kind of community center, an auditorium, a kind of community service component to them, and something called the Monument Field Office. Of course, most recently, one of the largest George Floyd memorials was held in Cadman Plaza. So I guess in closing, and we can talk about this in the discussion, the scholar Danielle Ellen has talked about the relation between, in an article on connectedness, the relation between connectedness and different notions of connectedness in our ability to build a better democracy and to build linkages. She talks about three kinds of connectedness: bonding, bridging, and linking. Bonding are the connectedness you have with family and people you're intimate with. Linking are hierarchical relationships like the ones between teachers and students or in institutions. And the ones she's most interested in are bridging. And these are the kinds of connectedness that exist between race and class and occupation and religion. And I'd say that the potential for the kinds of spaces that Irene ended in speaking about the lynching memorial and others, to create this kind of bridging function to bring people together is extremely important and is one of the potentials of monument making. And I'll close there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and also Irene, to you as well. That's a lot of ground covered, and from two very different perspectives and also very different understandings of time, right? And, so Richard, I've been in the class with you and have really appreciated your incredible knowledge of monument making in the United States and the histories and the overarching idea that we're striving to be democratic. There are democratic ideals being put forth in these monuments. There is certainly a pride in American exceptionalism, and there is a kind of march across the country as the frontier was conquered. And, at the same time, what's curious to me is we find ourselves in this space today where the conversation is polarized, where we have monuments being questioned, whether they are elements from or vestiges of war or from other aspects of American history. And so, their individual stories, these kind of America's portrayal of self is also fraught with sometimes myth or sometimes inaccuracy. And so I'm curious to think about this idea of the monument as an artifact of a bygone era, but that still embodies some kind of power. And Irene, I really appreciated the idea that monuments are slow, but within that slowness, there's power. And so from my perspective, and thinking about things like the Mellon Foundation, which just announced a $250 million grant-funded program on monuments, raising questions. Do we leave them in place? Do we modify them in some way, or do we take them down? And I want to also predicate this, Richard, with a clear thought to you, which is that I don't know that we should only be looking at monuments. I think that we should be looking at monuments. We should be looking at social injustice, economic disparity, housing, all of these things I think we should look at once, because for me personally, especially someone who operates in the space of a curatorial place and presenting didactic information to people with the hope that there will be learning, I guess what I would ask both of you to kind of speak to a little bit is, how you feel we could move forward to address these wrongs with monuments and somehow come together in a way, not only provide information that corrects the history, we kind of reconsider the problematic components of them unfix them from their time and, you know, address the real history of them or the real story behind them.
Irene, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, there was a lot in there, and I'm first of all, thank you, Richard, for the sort of panorama of kind of historical moments of American monuments. I think there were so many great kind of quirky stories in there. And I think one thing that you really demonstrated is that monuments aren't just the object, but they always have this kind of bigger context and story. They're, you know, they relate to a kind of urban context and urban politics, a racial context and racial politics. And they have long lives, right? So I was kind of thinking as you were talking about how in many of the debates that we're having now about what to do with Confederate monuments, that there's a kind of image of them as once having been built, there's a permanence to them. Whereas in fact, monuments, there's kind of several moments in time when there's sort of critical junctures, right? There's the moment of their conception and all the kind of energy and politics that goes into deciding that we should have a monument up to something, right? And why and what communities that calls into being. There's the moment of their creation and inauguration. There's the moment of their sort of ongoing reception and the way that that changes over time. And then there's the moment of their kind of reevaluation, reinterpretation, reimagination as something else. And we're seeing, you know, that moment kind of playing out now with a lot of the Confederate monuments. So, you know, it's sort of to really grapple with their politics and their capacities. Like, you have to accept that it's not a kind of fixed thing, that it has this kind of longer duration, and that any of those kind of the fate of that monument and what that monument means and to what different kinds of communities absolutely changes. And I think that's something that we just have to kind of embrace. And, you know, that's kind of one big thing that I drew from your talk. So I've actually now forgotten how this kind of relates back to the question that you asked, Stephen, but that was sort of one thought that was kind of really playing out as Richard was speaking.
Richard, I didn't know if you wanted to respond.
Well, you know, I mean, there are examples of, you know, to pick up on what Irene's saying, there are examples of a piece Glenn and I worked on, is, you know, there was an incident in the late 19th century, the Haymarket bombing, which was a kind of signal moment in labor history. A number of the people that were accused of making the bombing happen were hung. And at the time they produced the government made a police monument. And that monument was unpopular from the start. People, it was hit with the trolley car, it got moved, they kept moving it around the city because it failed in its attempt to kind of celebrate the so-called order that police brought then. And then in the late 60s, the Weather Underground blew it up once, and then they reconstructed it, and then they blew it up again. So there are, you know, Irene is right. These things are not nearly as stable as they appear, and even Independence Hall, that's kind of, you know, bedrock in the history of American history. There are a lot of struggles about which form it should take. I was asked to write something about the remaking of they remade the mall in the 90s into the 2000s and moved the Liberty Bell, and I was actually shocked because the project was sort of already mostly finished and under construction, that, you know, the history of abolition and slavery and the fact that many of the people involved there owned slaves and there was infrastructure there, that in remaking this is 15 years ago, they didn't deal with any of that. Then they had to go back and kind of shoehorn it in, right? So yes, the reconciling is important.
Yeah, I mean, I feel very much like we're in this space where I would like to believe that this country is finally going to learn something and address something and reckon with its history more than I think I've ever seen before in my lifetime. I hope I'm right. And so I guess thinking toward that and thinking toward the idea that you could assemble stakeholders that all have a say in recasting something and reconfiguring, retelling a story so that we don't have to think about the fact that, you know, once the restoration ended, you know, that's when the Confederate monuments started to pop up, right?
Right.
And there was this issue that the South was actually pushing back on this notion, as you said, Irene, in your text, of Black supremacy. You know, just because people were being freed as slaves and given, you know, the opportunity to vote and own land. And so I guess I'm curious to hear from you how you think that that effort might be possible. But how can we, you know, taking it past the step of empathy and taking it past the step of a call to act, almost generating an environment where recasting can be an act of healing.
I don't know about healing. I think that what some of these sites function as are kind of focal points.
Right.
And as I was saying at the end, reference to Daniel Allen, that they suggest the possibility of creating kind of new connections and new networks of affinity for people. And that's why I ended with Cadman Plaza. I mean, that was, you know, it's a war memorial, but basically you can imagine that being, the site is a kind of infrastructure for protest, but it could be even more so with a different kind of design for the, you know, the community center and other things. So I think I don't know how much work the design of the monuments themselves can do to heal. I think they are really more like they draw people in.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, one sort of trend that I've seen in monument erection is that you know, in the 19th century and early 20th century, it was often that it was like an interest group, right? Italian Americans or Daughters of the Confederacy that sort of fundraised and then put up a monument through their, you know, sort of, it was kind of imposition on a park. So like if you go to Central Park, a lot of the, you know, statuary that's there, it was put up by some small community organization and, you know, and privately funded, and then they put a monument up. These days, when you put up a monument, and I'm thinking, for example, of the UVA Memorial, I just saw a talk by Mi Jin Yoon and Mabel Wilson and a few others sort of to inaugurate that monument. There was such a huge community process, a long process, you know, gathering together stakeholders, using the idea of creating a monument to initiate discussions about additional historical research, to engage, you know, community members, people who were descendants of enslaved people in Charlottesville. So like nowadays, when you put up a monument, speaking of, you know, how a monument becomes more democratic, I think there is a sense that all of that has to be built into the process. It's not just like, I'm going to, you know, put up my monument and then you can put up yours, and they'll sort of argue it out, you know, across a park space. So that has become, I think, an element of the way that monuments are organized and come to be built now. That was maybe less critical than in the past. I think it also speaks to, you know, the way that designers' work has to change to be focused not just of the kind of formal expression or how a monument is read, but also, you know, there's a question about to what extent as a designer you're able to and willing to engage in that kind of bigger process.
Right. And conversation with parties who would be directly affected by the outcome.
Yeah.
I am going to take a question from Nora Akawi.
Thank you. Thank you both, and Stephen and Lydia for this talk. I wanted I was struck by the bringing together of the video and the testimony alongside the video or the testimony alongside the monument, and also in relation to the gathering of stakeholders. It reminded me of a film which collapses both into one medium. It's called Ghost Hunting, and it features Palestinian political prisoners who were victims of torture under administrative detention, which is imprisonment without trial. The filmmaker Raed Andoni, who's a survivor he was a political prisoner himself, brings together a cast of other survivors from the same detention center and their families, and together they reenact incidents. One another and playing different roles, including the prison guards and so on. But also, and I think more relevant to this conversation, what they do is they rebuild the detention center based on their memories. In it, they spent a lot of time blindfolded or in solitary confinement. So the film, which is very much kind of following not just the reenactment, but the reconstruction of the architecture in a large warehouse in Ramallah, is understood by many as kind of therapeutic, as a therapeutic activity. And in a conversation that I happened to attend with the filmmaker, I think for him it was more a call for action. So the film itself doesn't go viral, but it lingers, it haunts the viewer. And particularly, I think, since the viewers, we witness the victims recollecting memories through the reconstruction of the architecture that staged this these crimes, right? And I wonder if this can tell us something about monuments, and also, in relation to testimony and empathy, but also in relation to, the process, the building together of stakeholders, the temporality and so on. I've been thinking about this film a lot, and I'm gonna drop the link to the trailer in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I have not seen the film, so I'm excited to look at it. I think it's so interesting. I mean, as you're talking, I was thinking about the old association of memory with space. So the memory palace idea. So that seems to be kind of maybe what's activated here is kind of a mnemonics of space, right? So that you can recall and retrieve the reality of that experience of detention through the spatial reconstruction, because in your memory, the kind of vividness of moving through a space and recollecting that somehow it sort of like brings the texture and kind of experience to life. So I think there's definitely kind of a way that rhymes with this notion of the power of the spatial experience of going to a site and walking through it. So I think, both the kind of film that you're describing and the kind of reconstruction and the kind of the power of the spatial monument that I was talking, they both draw on, I go back to Walter Benjamin, the kind of famous idea of the haptic experience of space being this kind of everyday thing that seeps into your brain because you're not entirely attentive, but because you're experiencing by walking and passing by a landscape every day. So I think I think that does somehow speak to the kind of unique power of architecture and spatial experience to impart some kind of consciousness. I'm really intrigued, though. I mean, I'm curious about the kind of link between the therapeutic and the call for action, and why they're to make that leap or jump, because I think that is definitely the risk that some of the memorials that I was talking about fall into as well. But
there's another kind of I guess curious question I have, or axis here. So yes, there's the call to action, but then there's when we talk about the potential of these things to create networks and bring different kinds of people with different experiences together. There's this question about well, we know it's important to build them so that people see their experience or the experience of their families and ancestors manifest, but they're also often conceived this kind of pedagogical purpose of explaining these things to people who aren't part of that experience, right? And it's those relationships and the empathy it creates from one group to another that I think is the critical thing, right? When part of my family were victims of the Holocaust, and when I was younger, when I first went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, I thought, well, I didn't like it because of the theatrics you described in this other project. And I thought, well, this isn't for me because I already kind of know about this, right? But then I went back to it more recently, and my whole feeling about it softened because I went and I spent time there and I watched everyone else responding to the material. And I think that's extremely, that's a kind of democratic idea that basically, you create these spaces and stories so people identify with others in other places and in a kind of even a more transnational environment, because there are many different well, the experiences aren't analogous, but I think that's an important aspect, and it does speak to who you bring together to conceive these things.
Thank you. I've got a question from Eva Frank.
Mm-hmm.
No, Stephen, sorry, it wasn't a question necessarily. I just shared a link with everyone that I think first of all, thanks for organizing this. It has been an incredible talk from both of you. And I just think it's very timely in many places, not only in the US, obviously, and how do we actually engage with this history and this legacy, and how the politics allow us to do so. So a letter that just came out that was sent by the Minister of Culture, or the Secretary of Culture in the UK, is banning cultural institutions from commissioning or producing work that tries to question or to rewrite or to, in fact, take a position on any of those heritage buildings, sculptures, or artworks. And I think that to see this happening within a place like the UK, where supposedly one is dealing with democracy, although we know by many different angles that that's not the case, I think it's really dangerous. And somehow the question here is, how do we ensure that, despite of what strategy we decide to take forward, that in fact we do have the freedom as architects or as artists to be able to engage with that as an open conversation and discussion, and not to take for granted that that is something that is always to be there. No, that in fact, like taking Lydia's background as the act of defending that freedom is something that we need to constantly manifest. And I just wanted to share that link because I didn't want to move away from the US conversation that I think has its own problematics and specifics, but I thought it was just good for everyone to somehow have a reality check in relationship to some things that are happening not too far away. That was it. Thank you, Stephen.
Well, I just want to say this term and concept of heritage is extremely problematic. And you see it in the British context because, it's almost an anti-democratic idea. History matters. Heritage is a made-up story to kind of claim dominion over something that people often don't have. And so it's been taken, we have the World Heritage Sites and these things, some of them done under good auspices, but the term heritage and its application to the built environment, we could have a whole other discussion about that. It's extremely problematic, especially in the UK.
So I've got a question from Mauricio. Mauricio?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, you cut out for a second. So my question is mostly, I want to bring it back to the context of what we're living through today. And also, looking at Richard, I want to bring up a question that you asked, or the sympathy that you brought up about, the kind of building infrastructure and also welfare projects as you know, an investment that could be more useful than, say, building a monument. And I found this a little disconcerting in the sense that as architects who use representation to build something, it's kind of analogous to someone using memory, and as Irene kind of articulated, using these different ways of responding to form and responding to historical monuments, and also to build work as a way to develop memory. And this memory is a way of creating a nation, creating identity. So how could we say that, how could you even compare building a nation or an idea of a nation through monument building and building infrastructure? I think they're comparable in a way that who gets to build, but who gets to build those? So I guess to bring it back to a question is, I think in a way your survey that you gave us today kind of sidesteps this idea of memory as a building block. And I was wondering if you could speak about that.
Well, I think that I guess what I didn't say is a lot of these projects are allegorical in the sense that they take a theme. I mean, if you take the creation of this mall in Philadelphia, Independence Mall, it was started as actually its impetus was as a traffic abatement scheme to manage traffic coming off of a new bridge, and a fear that somehow the traffic and all these things were going to, there was a kind of scare that was created that was going to, you know, the Independence Hall was going to be set on fire, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that I met this provocation that monuments have a certain instrumentality, both in the way that they retell history, but also they're often tied to things that are infrastructural. I mean, the interstate highway system was first imagined as the Lincoln Highway. Eisenhower, who was, you know, the president who made that happen, traveled on the Lincoln Highway and was inspired by this highway, which was really a highway improvement project under the kind of guise of being a tribute to Abraham Lincoln. So I don't think you can undo these things. They are layered on top of each other, right?
So we're coming up on the 8:30 hour here, so I think we'll take one more question, and I think Lydia would like to ask it.
I don't know if it's a question or more of a conversation. I want to thank you both for your incredible insights and the overview of these very important questions that we're dealing with today. Irene, was struck when you presented, what was very clear in your talk was the shift from the figuration to the abstraction, and the kind of recent memorials of architecture that erase figurality and the kind of literal representation, and through abstraction and quantification, they illustrate an event. And I was wondering, when you showed the image of George Floyd projected on the Confederate monument, what was very striking was this practice of rewriting the monument, like a kind of other layer projected onto it, which was neither choosing, let's say, a tool of abstraction or figuration, but it was a kind of almost like an organic process that happens to every monument as they're occupied by different groups in time. Like being Greek, I've been taught at school the history of the Acropolis, and through, in time, it was occupied for different reasons. And, the meaning was rewritten and detached, relative to the beliefs and ideologies of each group that was occupying. So in Ottoman occupation, it became a storage for gunpowder, and all the meanings of the Greek columns were entirely erased and some were torn down. So I was wondering how you feel about the kind of takeover, the guerrilla strategy of taking over the monuments, whether you have some insights as how one might understand them as slow processes in time. I was very intrigued by that concept, and I was wondering if you could speak to it. And thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think those moments when these statues, which, you know, I think some people have been debating Confederate monuments for many years, and there are probably people in those communities for whom this presence of those statues has been, you know, graded and been a source of irritation for many decades. But, you know, a lot of these monuments are inert and forgotten and ignored, right? This is the kind of Mumford idea that, and Reinhard Koselleck also talks about these like 19th century monuments that you see in parks. Like many people just ignore them because they speak in a different language of a kind of bygone era, right? And so in a way, the best thing that could happen in terms of like, as a society are grappling with history, is for people to take them up again, to pay attention to them again, and try to reinvent them and manipulate them and project on them and topple them and do things. I mean, I think that's a super exciting kind of moment that the kind of present time has, you know, sort of called forth.
What's amazing is that you see this proliferation now of these projections and appropriation and changing of these monuments, but you have artists like Krzysztof Wediczko and Raphael Lozano Hemmer who have been doing this for, you know, well, Wediczko for decades actually, and I think it's just amazing to see, and he relates to what I showed earlier, these kind of, you know, the projections in the Peel Museum. He relates his own art to this history of lantern projections and the kind of popular spectacle. So I think the more the merrier for in terms of more people being able to take up these techniques.
Yeah, I will just add one thing, which is that, you know, people who study monuments, like I've heard sort of Kirk Savage and others talk about how maybe 10 years ago, they would have sort of embraced the idea that, you know, what you do with Confederate monuments is don't kind of remove them, but change them, reinterpret them, recontextualize them, put another placard on, you know, to sort of historicize them and recontextualize them.
Yeah.
Right. I think we may be getting to a moment, and communities have to kind of decide this for themselves through, you know, deliberation and debate, but where it's not enough to do a projection to recontextualize, right? Because the presence of these monuments speaks so powerfully to a kind of long history, and is so alienating and so, you know, sort of denigrating of the right of certain other people to exist and be in the community, that it's like it's not enough to recontextualize them. Like, we have to do something more radical.
Well, they were created with bad intentions.
They were created to, you know, impose, to intimidate, as expressions of white power, reassertions of white power in the, you know, in the post-Reconstruction South. And so given that history, like their presence is kind of traumatizing, you know, at the present moment. And so, you know, so I think it's a kind of, it's an evolving discussion, as we've been talking about. Monuments signify differently to different people at different moments in time. And so, you know, we're kind of experiencing one of these moments of rapid change. And so I think these debates are ones that are important to have, what to do.
Agreed, very much so. And I think as long as it continues to evolve, then there's, you know, hope for some significant change. I want to take a moment just to thank both of you for your presentations this evening and for some really good dialogue. And I have a feeling this is a subject that we will also revisit at Cooper Union once again. Thank you. And to everybody who participated and lent questions, thank you as well.
Thank you all.
All right.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.